In a frigid courtroom in Dallas, Judge Jasmine Crockett was struck across the face by a police officer, right in the middle of an ongoing trial. And just 5 minutes later, she began dismantling a corrupt system that had decayed from the inside for more than a decade. That slap didn't just rattle the courtroom. It sparked a chain of events that made the pillars of power tremble, launched sweeping investigations, and dragged once untouchable figures into the unforgiving light of justice. What could push a judge to shatter the silence and risk it all to expose the very system that once empowered her? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The icy wind outside the Dallas Federal Courthouse sliced through the air like a warning. Something was about to fracture. Judge Jasmine Crockett entered the courtroom composed but watchful. She had once been a prominent civil rights attorney in Washington, a fierce advocate for justice. Now, as one of the few black women seated on a federal bench, she stood in the middle of a system that was never built to welcome her. People didn't speak it aloud, but their eyes told the story. Some looked at her with quiet challenge. Others couldn't meet her gaze at all. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick with unease. Jasmine knew this wasn't just another case. This was a battle, and she had to be prepared. The courtroom was unnaturally quiet. Too quiet. Jasmine Crockett had just delivered the opening remarks in what was anticipated to be the most high-profile police misconduct trial in the state's recent memory. Sergeant Victor Arbun, the defendant, was accused of excessive force during a traffic stop that led to the death of 19-year-old unarmed black teenager, Elijah Trent. Body cam footage had mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses had been coerced into silence. And for 2 years, the case had been buried, until a whistleblower released internal documents revealing Arbun's long history of violent encounters, all hidden by his department. Now, with the nation watching, Jasmine was responsible for restoring order and clarity to a case that had become a symbol of everything fractured in the justice system. She adjusted her glasses and gave the nod for the bailiff to proceed. When it happened, Victor Arbun stepped forward, not in a respectful, formal manner. He didn't seek permission. He didn't wait for his attorney. He simply took 3 deliberate steps toward the bench until he was within arm's reach. The courtroom barely had time to react. The guard blinked but didn't move. Jasmine lifted her chin, about to question his actions. Then crack. The slap came so suddenly it barely felt real. Arbun's hand collided with Jasmine's face with a force meant not only to injure, but to demean. The sound ricocheted off the marble walls like a gunshot. Jasmine's head turned slightly from the impact. A dead silence fell over the room, so absolute it felt suffocating. No one screamed. No one stood. Not even a flash from the press cameras went off. For a few moments, the courtroom was frozen. Not in confusion, but in fear. Arbun didn't flinch. He didn't yell. He simply stood there, eyes cold, breathing even, as though daring the system to retaliate. Then he spoke, his voice oozing with scorn. "There. Now we're even, Your Honor," he said, each word slow, sharp, dripping with contempt. "You want to judge me? Try doing it without hiding behind that robe. We both know you don't belong in that seat." He smirked, a crooked, arrogant, "I dare you" kind of smirk. The kind that said he believed he had just won. This wasn't merely an assault on a judge. It was a strike at everything he resented. A black woman in the highest seat of the courtroom, daring to hold him accountable. The court clerk's hands trembled. A juror's pen rolled onto the floor, but no one moved to retrieve it. One of the defense attorneys whispered something under his breath, face pale with shock. The tension wasn't just in the air anymore. It had settled into everyone's bones. The sharp sting on her cheek hadn't yet faded when Jasmine Crockett made her move. She didn't call for order. She didn't raise her voice. She simply straightened her back, locked eyes with the man who had just struck her, and transformed the moment into command. "Bailiff," she said, calm but cutting, "retrieve the complete personnel file of Sergeant Victor Arbun." Effective immediately, the courtroom remained frozen. Even the court reporter had paused, unsure she'd heard correctly. Jasmine never broke eye contact with Arbun, who stood there, smug, his posture unshaken, waiting for her to falter. Not from the district attorney's office, she added, her voice louder now. Go directly to internal affairs. I want the full record, unredacted, and I want it before this session resumes. Her voice echoed through the chamber like a challenge, and suddenly, everyone understood this wasn't over. It was just beginning. The bailiff moved quickly, but his steps were heavy, as if burdened with more than just responsibility. Jasmine stayed perfectly still. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She simply waited. Every camera now turned toward her. Every journalist typed furiously without ever looking down. Even the defense team remained motionless, stunned into silence. It took less than 15 minutes for the file to arrive. A sealed manila envelope, thick with documents and bound tight with a rubber band like a cinder block. The bailiff handed it to her, hands shaking. Jasmine received it with unwavering calm. She set it on the bench, removed the band, and opened it carefully. Page by page, like she was peeling back a lie. Her eyes scanned the contents, and with each second, the expression on her face grew more severe. Page after page of glowing performance reviews, commendation letters, and standard patrol records. But something was off. The real contents were missing. No mention of the Elijah Trent incident. No trace of the 2021 case involving a homeless veteran beaten during a mental health call. Not one complaint. Not a single internal investigation. Nothing. It was spotless. Too spotless. A file that clean didn't just raise suspicions, it reeked of a cover-up. She flipped back to the front page and began reading the officer's career history. Line by line, there were discrepancies. 6-month periods with no recorded activity. Sections where the formatting felt off. Inconsistent fonts, uneven margins. Amateur mistakes, but incriminating nonetheless. When Jasmine finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. This file, she said, lifting a page, states that Sergeant Boone was on administrative leave during the week of July 3rd, the same week Elijah Trent was killed during a stop he initiated. She held the page up. The date is typed, but the signature field is left blank. Her eyes shifted toward the prosecution's table, where the district attorney looked visibly rattled. Can someone explain to the court, she went on, why this file claims Boone wasn't on duty, while our forensic evidence, GPS logs, dispatch audio, and eyewitness accounts all place him at the scene? No response. She leaned in, voice rising just slightly, enough to rattle the walls. And why does this file contain 0 use of force reports? Not a single notation. Not even one contested arrest. She flipped through another stack of pages. We have public complaints. We have leaked video evidence. And yet, according to this document, Boone is a model officer with an untarnished record. She turned her gaze directly to the assistant DA, now frozen in place, eyes wide with disbelief. Either this file has been manipulated, Jasmine stated, or someone is feeding this court falsified documents. The tension in the courtroom didn't explode. It constricted, drawing tighter and tighter. A juror shifted uncomfortably. Someone murmured under their breath. Boone's attorney leaned back in his chair, ghost pale. The moment felt unreal, like a veil had just been lifted, exposing something that had always been there, hidden, but now undeniable. Jasmine didn't sit. She didn't exhale. She doubled down. Let me make this absolutely clear, she said, rising behind the bench, file opened wide in her hands. This court will not be deceived. I don't care who compiled this file, who approved it, or whose name is stamped on the final page. If this record has been doctored, there will be consequences. The room fell silent, a silence that carried more weight than a gavel ever could. Everyone knew this wasn't just about Victor Boone anymore. It was about the system that had shielded him, and that system was beginning to fracture. Still standing, still composed, Jasmine reached under the bench and retrieved a sealed plastic evidence envelope from the court clerk's tray. It was unremarkable. A black flash drive, scratched and scuffed, no larger than a paperclip. But what it held, Jasmine knew, had the power to shake the courtroom to its foundation. This, she announced, her tone calm and calculated, was submitted anonymously 48 hours ago. No return address, no request for recognition, Just a flash drive labeled with one word, "Listen." She glanced at the IT technician seated beside her. "Load it into the courtroom display. Play it from the top, no edits." The technician hesitated, then inserted the drive. The screen flickered. Speakers buzzed with static. Then the sound of a door creaking open. Footsteps. And then Boone's voice. Clear. Distinct. Unmistakable. "You get that footage deleted?" "What footage?" a second male voice asked, uncertain. "The body cam. Trent, don't play dumb. I told you, get rid of it. Nothing on file. Nothing to explain." A pause. "Jesus, Vic, you shot a kid." Another pause. Then Boone again, cold and flat. "You want to keep your job or not?" The words hovered in the air like smoke after a fire. No one dared move. Jasmine leaned forward and tapped the spacebar, freezing the playback mid-sentence. She then turned her gaze slowly across the courtroom, from the prosecutors to the jury to the press gallery. "There is no version of this audio," she said softly, "that can be dismissed as anything other than what it is. A man attempting to conceal the killing of an unarmed minor, and a system complicit in helping him do it." She let the silence settle for 3 full seconds. Before she could continue, Boone erupted, slamming his hands onto the defense table. The sound cracked through the room like a shot. His face burned red with fury. His voice now unhinged. "That recording is fake," he shouted, eyes bulging, jaw clenched. "You think some random flash drive proves anything? That could be anyone. Any voice. You call this justice? This is a setup." The room jolted. Reporters raised their phones again. A juror gasped. Boone's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering frantically, trying to calm him. But Boone shook him off and stood fully, seething. "You people think you can just throw accusations and call it truth?" he barked. "I've spent 20 years wearing this badge. 20 years protecting this damn city while politicians and punks sat back and did nothing." "Sergeant Boone," Jasmine said, her voice like a blade drawn in silence. "You will sit down. Now." But Boone didn't budge. His eyes bore into her, a threat simmering. Only when the bailiff stepped forward, hand cautiously hovering near his belt, did Boone finally back away, still boiling with rage. Jasmine remained motionless. Then she brought out her next weapon. "This," she said, holding up a second piece of paper. Its edges slightly crumpled, the ink faded, but still legible, "is the sworn statement of Officer Marisol Kendrick, the first responder at the scene. She gave this testimony the day after Elijah Trent's death, and then she vanished. No follow-up. No sepine. Not even a mention in the case record." Jasmine unfolded the page and read aloud, her voice unwavering. The subject was lying on his side, hands visible, not resisting. He was crying, asking for help. "I saw Sergeant Boone fire his weapon. I did not see a weapon on the subject. He had no weapon. I was later instructed by my supervisor to leave this incident out of my shift report." Signed, dated, and notarized. This time, the gasp was audible. A juror covered her mouth. Another leaned forward in disbelief. Even the stenographer stopped typing, her eyes fixed on Jasmine. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She wasn't finished. Next, she raised 2 heavy binders, one in each hand. "What I have here," she began, lifting the binder in her left hand, "is the file submitted to this court by the district attorney's office. It shows Sergeant Boone with a perfect record. No disciplinary action, no prior incidents, glowing reviews from his superiors." She paused and raised the second binder higher. "And this," she continued, "this is the federal file from the 5th Circuit, compiled during a civil investigation last year. This file contains reports that the DA's version omits: complaints, use of force summaries, internal warnings, witness memos." She opened both files and laid them side by side on the bench. "Let's compare," she said, her tone sharp. She pointed to a page. "The DA's file claims Boone received a commendation in March 2021. The 5th Circuit file shows that during the same month, he was under internal investigation for an undocumented takedown of a minor. That report disappeared from the local record, but is still in the federal archive. She flipped to another section. Here, 2020. The DA's version shows exemplary conduct on duty. The federal version, however, lists 2 civilian complaints, both alleging excessive force, both closed with no action. One of the victims was hospitalized, the other relocated out of state. Neither case made it past the initial review. She raised her eyes, now blazing, not with fury but with control. This court is being asked to make decisions based on documents that are lies, she said. And we are being expected to accept those lies because they are clean, because they're convenient, and because they protect men like Sergeant Boone from being held responsible for the blood they spill. The entire courtroom was silent. Even Boone had shifted in his seat, his posture no longer confident but calculating, as though he sensed the change in the atmosphere, not in his favor. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice unwavering. I'm not here to play politics. I'm not here to play games. I'm here to ensure that this court hears the truth. A truth that this system has been burying for years. And today, that truth has a voice. The air in the courtroom had become eerily still. Too still, as though everyone sensed that the ground beneath them had begun to crumble. Jasmine paused briefly, scanning the room. Not as a judge, but as someone who had just turned a quiet war into an open confrontation. And yet, she wasn't done, not by a long shot. She shifted her gaze slightly, eyes narrowing toward the back row of the observation gallery. The court recognizes a new witness, she announced, her voice cutting through the tension. Mr. Alexander Vance, please stand. A ripple of movement passed through the room. Chairs shifted. A man in his 50s, wiry with salt and pepper hair and a worn leather notebook in his hands, slowly stood. Until now, he had been quiet, just another face in the crowded courtroom. But Jasmine had known he was there. She had made sure of it. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice steady, you served as a senior internal affairs investigator from 2004 to 2021. Please confirm. Were you ever assigned a case involving Sergeant Victor Boone? Vance cleared his throat, his voice raw but resolute. Yes, in 2019. And what became of that case? Jasmine asked, leaning forward just enough for the cameras to capture the full weight of the moment. I was ordered to close it, Vance replied, his eyes scanning the room as though checking who was listening. It was classified under incomplete evidence, he added, even though we had witness testimony and body cam metadata. He gripped the notebook tighter. I was told by my division head to transfer it to the lost archive. Buried was the word he used. I objected. A week later, I was pulled from internal affairs and reassigned to desk work. The room stood motionless. Jasmine nodded slowly. So you're telling this court under oath that the evidence existed, but was deliberately suppressed? Yes, Vance replied, his voice steady. And Boone wasn't the only one being protected. The revelation hit like a shockwave. The tension in the room erupted into whispers. A reporter in the second row dropped his notepad. Someone in the jury box murmured, "Oh my God," but it wasn't over. Before Jasmine could speak again, another voice cut through the courtroom like a bolt of lightning. I can't do this anymore, the voice said. Everyone turned. It was one of the courthouse's own officers, a young deputy, no older than 30, standing at his post near the wall. His hands were clenched at his sides. I can't stand here and pretend this place stands for justice, he said, his voice trembling but defiant. Not when evidence is erased, not when voices are buried. I swore to protect this court, but I can't protect a lie. The gasps turned into chaos. Cameras snapped to attention. Boone's attorney jumped up again, shouting over the noise. The bailiff moved forward, uncertain whether to restrain him or escort him out. But Jasmine raised her hand, just once, and the room stilled. Let him speak, she commanded, her voice neither angry nor surprised, but firm and undeniable. The young officer looked at her, then, with visible relief, simply removed his badge, placed it on the bench near the jury box, and walked out of the courtroom. The courtroom exploded. Dozens of people were speaking at once. reporters shouting into microphones, the press pool crowding closer to the rail, even the jurors looking unsettled and stunned. Yet Jasmine remained unmoved. She stood at the center of the storm, calm, composed, and unshaken. She reached for her gavel, and when she brought it down, it wasn't just a call for order. It was a declaration of finality. Bang! The sound echoed like a shot. "Enough," she said, standing tall. "This court will now proceed with immediate action." All eyes turned to her. Boone, visibly shaken for the first time, looked pale. His hands were clenched, and his shoulders were tense. But there was no bravado left in him, only fury and fear. "Based on the new testimony from Mr. Vance and the unauthorized suppression of evidence, I hereby file a motion to initiate a criminal investigation into Prosecutor Livia Ramsey for obstruction of justice and official misconduct," Jasmine stated clearly, her voice cutting through the noise like thunder through glass. Ramsey blinked rapidly, opening her mouth to object, but no words came out. She merely stared, frozen. Jasmine didn't wait. She turned to the bailiff and further declared, "In light of Sergeant Boone's direct violation of courtroom conduct, his intimidation of court officers, and the emerging evidence of obstruction and conspiracy, this court now orders his immediate detainment pending further investigation." The gallery erupted into a frenzy. Journalists shouted questions, jurors gasped, and Boone screamed something unintelligible as two bailiffs moved quickly to his side. He tried to resist, but one officer grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back in a practiced motion. The cuffs clicked loud and final. "You can't do this," Boone snarled. "You don't get to do this to me." Jasmine looked at him one last time, not with anger, but with clarity. "I didn't do this to you," she said, her voice steady. "You did it to yourself with every lie, every cover-up, every moment you thought power meant immunity." The reporters swarmed forward, shouting questions, the room flashing with lights as if history were being written in real time. Jasmine remained still, letting the noise swirl around her like water against stone. This wasn't chaos, it was correction, and she was the one delivering it. There was no need for a gavel. The room was already on the edge of collapse, and Jasmine Crockett, without raising her voice and without flinching, was the one pushing it there. The courtroom was still caught in the aftershock of her barrage of evidence when Jasmine slowly closed the two binders in front of her. The sound of paper against wood was like the final click of a locked door. One Boone could no longer open. He sat stiffly now, no longer leaning back in comfort, but forward in quiet panic. His hands were clasped too tightly, and his breathing was shorter than before. Across the room, the district attorney stared down at the table, avoiding her eyes. The journalists had stopped taking notes. They were simply watching. Everyone was, because at that moment, it wasn't just about files or facts or legal codes. It was about the unbearable weight of truth, finally being dragged into the light. Jasmine stood tall behind the bench, her voice calm, low, controlled, like a blade unsheathed in the dark. She looked Boone directly in the eyes, not with rage, but with certainty, a stillness that only came from surviving too many battles to flinch at one more. "You thought that slap was power," she said, her voice carrying through the marble chamber like it belonged there. "But what you didn't see, what you'll never understand, is that you just handed me the weapon I needed." Her words landed harder than any gavel. "You didn't expect a reaction," she continued, stepping closer to the edge of the bench. "Because men like you are used to silence. You're used to control, used to fear doing your work for you." She paused, then narrowed her eyes. "But not today." She took one breath, just one, then said it clearly, deliberately, and devastatingly. "You never imagined that slap would be the strike that brings down your entire empire." The room didn't gasp, it didn't erupt. It held its breath, because they all knew it had already started to fall. There was a beat of silence after Jasmine's final words to Boone. Then the entire courtroom began to shift, not with noise, not yet, but with energy. That quiet, unmistakable current that moves through a room just before something breaks wide open. Boone looked stunned. His jaw was locked tight, sweat visible on his hairline. Before the ripple of fear could settle into silence again, the defense attorney stood, his voice trembling beneath his polished courtroom tone. "Your Honor," he began, fumbling slightly with the button on his coat. "Given the unexpected nature of the evidence presented and the volatility of this moment, we respectfully request a temporary recess." Jasmine didn't let him finish. "Request denied," she said flatly, immediately cutting through his words like a blade. "This court does not pause for panic. Not when the stakes are this high. Not when lives were lost under silence." The defense attorney froze, lips parted, but the message was clear. She wasn't giving them a second to regroup. Then it happened. From the corner of the courtroom, near the clerk's station, a sound. Not a word, not a question. Just the high, panicked clatter of a chair falling backward. The courtroom clerk, a young woman perhaps in her late 20s, shook as she stood up so quickly that her notes flew off the desk. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her bag, and without a word, she turned and ran toward the side exit. One of the bailiffs stepped toward her, unsure whether to stop her or let her go. But Jasmine didn't even glance her way. She knew exactly what was happening. That clerk had seen something or heard something or knew something, and now, with the cracks forming in real time, she didn't want to be standing on a floor that might collapse. Jasmine's gaze shifted to the prosecution table, locking onto the woman seated second from the left. Neatly pressed gray blazer, diamond earrings, a stack of folders gripped just a little too tightly. Her nameplate gleamed under the court lights. Livia Ramsey, senior prosecutor. "M. Ramsey," Jasmine said, her tone cooling, becoming heavier like steel being drawn from a sheath. "Would you kindly step forward and confirm your involvement in the Boone-related cases filed between 2018 and 2023? The courtroom tensed again. Ramsey didn't move at first, but she didn't protest either. Jasmine continued. "You were the acting prosecutor in 5 cases involving Sergeant Boone, all of which resulted in dropped charges or procedural dismissals. The same signature appears across all 5 closures, yours." A quiet cough broke the stillness from the jury box. "Now," Jasmine said, reaching under her bench, "this court has just received 3 internal faxes dated over a 2-year span, originating from your office's fax line, all signed by your hand." She held them up slowly, unfolding them like blades. "These documents instruct subordinates to revise or omit language regarding the use of force in final filings for reports involving Victor Boone." A murmur swept through the room, but Jasmine didn't let the wave build. "This is obstruction. This is tampering. This is collusion at the highest prosecutorial level," she declared. "And it will not go unanswered in this courtroom." Now people began to move. Not a rush, not chaos, but quiet internal disarray. You could feel it. Eyes shifting, legs crossing, a few reporters typing furiously. One cameraman adjusted his live stream setup and pushed a notification out. "Breaking. Evidence points to prosecutor collusion. Live now." And then came the next fracture, this time from the jury box. "I'm sorry." A middle-aged man, juror number 7, stood, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't continue. I don't feel safe." Everyone turned. "I don't feel safe," he repeated, louder now. "Not after this. Not with what's being exposed. I'm being asked to make decisions about people who can erase witnesses and rewrite the truth." The bailiff moved toward him. "No, it's fine," Jasmine said, raising her hand calmly. "He's dismissed." The man looked stunned, then nodded quickly and exited through the side door. Another domino fell. The press section began buzzing louder now. The label had already started to stick. One reporter whispered loudly enough to be picked up by nearby microphones. "This is it. This is the 4-minute turn." Someone else repeated it on air. Then it spread. Hashtags formed. Screens lit up in real time. The courtroom was becoming legend. But Jasmine remained unmoved, centered in the eye of the storm. Because for her, this wasn't about theatrics. This was about accountability. She raised the 3 faxes again, speaking directly into the record. "These documents will be submitted to the Department of Justice for immediate review. And if verified, she added, locking eyes with Livia Ramsey. "You will be removed from this case and face federal obstruction charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519. Your badge does not protect you from perjury. Your title does not exempt you from consequence." Ramsey's lips parted, but no sound came out. Jasmine turned to the courtroom, now alive with energy, motion shifting, alliances forming and unraveling. "This," she said, her voice louder now, firm enough to echo past the gallery and through every live stream camera, "is no longer a routine trial. This is a reckoning, and everyone who chose silence over truth will be held accountable." The air in the courtroom had become dangerously still, too still, as if everyone sensed the floor beneath them was no longer solid. Jasmine paused only for a breath, scanning the room, not as a judge, but as someone who had just turned a silent war into a live battle. And yet, she wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. She turned her head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the back row of the observation gallery. "Court recognizes a new witness," she announced suddenly, her voice slicing through the tension. "Mr. Alexander Vance, please stand." There was a ripple of motion, sharp gasps, chairs shifting. A man in his 50s, wiry with salt and pepper hair, a worn leather notebook clutched in both hands, slowly stood. Until now, he had been silent, anonymous, just another spectator in a packed courtroom. But Jasmine had known he was there. She'd made sure of it. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice steady, "you served as a senior internal affairs investigator from 2004 to 2021. Please confirm, were you ever assigned a case involving Sergeant Victor Boone?" Vance cleared his throat, his voice raw but firm. "Yes, in 2019. "And what happened to that case?" Jasmine asked, leaning forward just enough for the cameras to catch the full gravity of the exchange. "I was ordered to close it," Vance replied, scanning the room as if checking who was listening. "Classified under incomplete evidence, even though we had witness testimony and body cam metadata." He tightened his grip on the notebook. "I was told by my division head to transfer it into the lost archive." Buried was the word he used. I objected. I was pulled off internal affairs a week later and reassigned to desk work. The room didn't breathe. Jasmine nodded slowly. "So you're telling this court, under oath, that the evidence existed and was suppressed deliberately?" "Yes," Vance said, his voice now steely. "And Boone wasn't the only one protected," he added, tightening his grip. It was like throwing gasoline on the courtroom, already soaked in tension. A wave of murmurs exploded around the room. A reporter in the second row dropped his notepad. Someone in the jury box whispered, "Oh my God!" But it wasn't over. Before Jasmine could speak again, another voice cut through the courtroom like a lightning strike. Young, male, trembling but defiant. "I can't do this anymore," the voice said. Everyone turned. It was one of the courthouse's own officers, a young deputy, barely 30, in a crisp blue uniform. He stood from his post near the wall, his hands clenched at his sides. "I can't stand here and pretend this place stands for justice," he continued, louder now, his voice cracking. "Not when evidence is erased. Not when voices are buried. I swore to protect this court, but I can't protect a lie." Gas turned into chaos. Cameras swung toward him. Boone's attorney stood again, shouting over the noise. The bailiff moved forward, unsure of what to do. Restrain him? Escort him out? But Jasmine raised her hand once, just once, and the room froze again. "Let him speak," she ordered. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't surprised. It was measured, firm, undeniable. The young officer looked at her, and with visible relief, he simply removed his badge, laid it on the bench near the jury box, and walked out of the room. The courtroom erupted. Dozens of people began talking at once. Reporters yelling into microphones, the press pool crowding closer to the rail. Even jurors looked shaken and still. Jasmine didn't move. She stood in the eye of the storm, calm, composed, unshaken. She reached for her gavel, and when she brought it down, it wasn't just a call for order. It was a declaration of finality. Bang! The sound rang out like a shot. "Enough," she said, standing. "This court will now proceed with immediate action." All eyes turned to her. Boone, visibly rattled, looked pale for the first time. His hands were clenched, his shoulders tight, but there was no bravado left in him, only fury and fear. "Based on the new testimony of Mr. Vance and the unauthorized suppression of evidence, I hereby file a motion to initiate a criminal investigation into Prosecutor Livia Ramsey for obstruction of justice and official misconduct," Jasmine stated clearly, her voice cutting through the noise like thunder through glass. Ramsey blinked rapidly, opening her mouth to object, but no words came. She simply stared, frozen. Jasmine didn't wait. She turned to the bailiff. "Further," she declared, "in light of Sergeant Boone's direct violation of courtroom conduct, his intimidation of court officers, and the emerging evidence of obstruction and conspiracy, this court now orders his immediate detainment pending further investigation." The gallery burst into a frenzy. Journalists shouting, jurors gasping, Boone shouting something unintelligible as two bailiffs moved quickly to his side. He tried to resist, but one officer grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back in a single practiced motion. The cuffs clicked loudly and final. "You can't do this," Boone snarled. "You don't get to do this to me." Jasmine looked at him one last time, not with anger, but with clarity. "I didn't do this to you," she said. "You did it to yourself with every lie, every cover-up, every moment you thought power meant immunity." The reporters swarmed forward, shouting questions, the room flashing with light as if history were being written in real time. Jasmine stood still, letting the noise pass around her like water against stone. This wasn't chaos, it was correction, and she was the one delivering it. The courtroom was still spinning behind her, the echoes of flashing cameras, gasps, and shouted questions. But Jasmine Crockett had already stepped into the corridor. She didn't linger for applause. She didn't acknowledge the press. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking down the marble floor like a metronome counting down to something bigger. Her breath was steady, but her shoulders carried weight now, new weight. Truth had cracked through the walls of the courtroom, but it came with a price. By the time she reached her chambers, silence inside felt like stepping into another world. No eyes, no whispers, no press. Just her in the aftermath. Jasmine locked the door behind her, walked to the desk, and sat down slowly. Not because she was tired, but because she had to think. Her mind was already 3 moves ahead. Then the phone rang. The sound was sharp, disrespectful, even. It didn't come through the secure court line. It came through her personal cell, the one almost no one had access to. She stared at it for a beat before answering. "This is Judge Crockett," she said, her voice flat. There was a pause. Then a voice, low, male, smooth like oil over rusted metal. "You just kicked over the wrong nest, Your Honor," the voice said. She said nothing. "Let me ask you something," the voice continued. "How's your boy these days? Still walk home from soccer? That neighborhood's not as safe as it used to be. And your mother? Does she still get her groceries delivered? Or is she stepping out again?" Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't breathe. But the silence around her thickened like fog in a dead forest. The voice continued. "You think this ends in a courtroom? You think you can rip masks off without consequences? No, Judge. What you did wasn't brave, it was stupid. We don't just survive inside the system. We are the system." Then, click. The line went dead. Jasmine lowered the phone gently onto the desk. Her hands were perfectly still, but inside her chest, something surged. Not fear, fire. Within 30 seconds, she picked up the red line, the secure court extension connected to federal security response. "This is Judge Jasmine Crockett. I'm ordering 24-hour protective details, starting now. My son, Daniel, 11 years old, lives with his grandmother, Margot. The address is on file. No contact allowed without clearance. Lockdown protocols effective immediately. Full surveillance. Full background on any movement near the premises." Her voice never wavered. She wasn't asking for safety. She was declaring a perimeter in a war zone. As she hung up, she didn't allow herself even a second of doubt. Instead, she turned to her computer and opened the encrypted federal case archive. The Boone file was just the beginning. What she needed now was the pattern. The rot wasn't one man. It was a decade of silence, rewritten reports, buried lives. She launched a cross-referenced audit, 10 years of Boone's cases. Everyone. The data loaded slow but steady. She scrolled through the results as they poured in: arrest logs, disciplinary reports, use of force incidents, prosecutorial outcomes. Her screen turned into a graveyard of redacted blocks and missing entry flags. And then the numbers began to speak. 9 separate cases where evidence logs were incomplete. The pattern was too precise to ignore: same formatting, same language, same clearance codes. Every time Boone had used force resulting in serious injury or worse, key portions of the reports had been flagged as unavailable due to technical errors or missing supporting documentation. She pulled open the individual case summaries. Case number 2431. Evidence log submitted, but body cam data listed as corrupted. Victim hospitalized. Charges dropped. Victim later deported. Case number 2847. Use of force report filed, but lacked audio or visual records. Victim shot twice during a traffic stop. Boone cleared. Case number 3112. No complaint ever filed, but hospital records showed blunt trauma consistent with baton strikes. Internal affairs entry overwritten. All of them buried in silence. Then the fatalities began to surface: 4 dead, for victims across 8 years. 1 was 17. 1 was undocumented. 1 was disabled. All were either black or immigrants. All died in what were described as resisted detainments. Not a single conviction, not even a suspension. Jasmine's chest tightened, not with grief, but with absolute clarity. This wasn't just Boone's story. It was a system designed to erase people like them, with just enough ink and legal jargon to look clean on the surface. Then she found it. Case number 1987, the file that stopped her cold. 1 sentence in bold. Autoscan from the old paper archive. All surveillance data unavailable. Request filed by Prosecutor L. Ramsey for permanent exclusion under discretionary review clause. Ramsey. It wasn't just negligence. It was orchestration. She'd signed it. Not a deputy, not an assistant, Livia Ramsey herself. And the footage wasn't lost. It was erased by court order under federal statute and sealed with a protective motion she'd never disclosed to anyone. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing. She no longer felt like she was looking at files. She felt like she was standing inside a crime scene. This wasn't incompetence. This was design. She pulled her keyboard closer and opened a secure link to the Office of Judicial Oversight. She dictated a short statement, measured, professional, but piercing, initiating formal review and internal investigation into all prosecutorial actions related to cases involving Sergeant Victor Boone from 2013 to 2023. Grounds: pattern of concealed evidence, potential abuse of prosecutorial privilege, and obstruction of judicial transparency. Immediate access requested to all encrypted correspondence logs between ADA Livia Ramsey and local law enforcement task force leaders. She paused before hitting send, not to hesitate, but to prepare for the consequences. Because after this, there would be no walking it back. The phone on her desk buzzed again. This time it was Max, her contact in digital forensics. "I ran the metadata on the files you sent over," he said. "Those case logs weren't just tampered with. They were rewritten from scratch, new document trees, new timestamps, everything. This wasn't sloppy. It was systematic. Someone high up built a program to overwrite the original records and log them as archived before they ever hit review." She closed her eyes, not to block the weight of it, but to focus. This was bigger than a courtroom. It was a machine, and she had just found the switch, buried under a mountain of silence. "Send me everything," she told Max, "every log, every name. And Max, don't just trace the files. Trace the approvals." Because it was no longer enough to expose Boone. Now, she had to name everyone who had protected him. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't just holding the gavel anymore. She was writing the blueprint for how to dismantle the entire structure. The office lights were still on when dawn broke across Dallas. Jasmine hadn't slept, not because she couldn't, but because there was no time left to waste. The files were ready, the testimonies organized, the evidence secured in triplicate across federal servers, and her decision was made. No more quiet investigations. No more chess moves in the shadows. It was time to go public. She stood before the press podium that afternoon in a room packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters from every major network. Federal marshals flanked the entrances. Cameramen lined the aisles like soldiers. The Department of Justice had offered to hold the press conference in D.C., but Jasmine refused. If it started in Texas, she had said, it ends in Texas. As she stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. A silence not of anticipation, but of weight. The nation knew something big was coming, and they knew Jasmine Crockett didn't speak unless every word was carved from truth. Her voice rang out, steady, clear, and precise. Today, I stand before you not just as a judge, but as a witness to a decade of buried truths, to a system that protected predators instead of the people, and to a machine that wore the mask of justice while quietly erasing it. She reached into the folder at her side and lifted the first file high enough for the cameras to see. This is the full, unredacted personnel file of Sergeant Victor Boone, now in federal custody. The original was tampered with, but this, she held it steady, includes what was erased, 9 missing reports for fatal encounters, and over a dozen instances of falsified evidence. All protected, all buried. The flashbulbs went off in unison. Her image was now everywhere, but she didn't blink. This drive, she continued, pulling out a sleek black USB stick, contains the anonymous recording of Boone confirming the destruction of body cam evidence in the death of Elijah Trent, a 19-year-old boy who had no weapon, no record, and no chance. He died in a ditch, and Boone walked free. Gasps rippled through the room. Hands shot up. Jasmine ignored them. This, she added, lifting another folder, is the sworn statement of Officer Marisol Kendrick, the first responder to Trent's death. Her report was hidden. She was reassigned. The system did what it always does when truth gets too close. It disappeared the messenger. A low murmur spread through the gallery. Then came the moment no one had anticipated, but everyone would remember. Jasmine looked up from the podium, eyes firm, unwavering. And now let's talk about the names. A hush fell as if even the walls leaned in. Livia Ramsey, Assistant District Attorney, signed the order to permanently erase camera footage from case number 1987. She has since been removed from her position and is under federal investigation. Judge Carlton Baines approved 6 plea deals with missing evidence, never questioning the redactions. He retired quietly 2 weeks ago and is now under internal review. Sheriff Paul Renner, involved in 3 cases with Boone, failed to submit internal affairs reports. He was promoted to head of task force oversight, but that ends today. She flipped the final page. These are not isolated errors. They are not clerical mistakes. They are deliberate, coordinated, and devastating. By now, the room was in controlled chaos. Journalists yelled questions over one another. Phones buzzed endlessly. Major outlets began cutting live to the feed, CNN, MSNBC, even Fox. Twitter was on fire. Jasmine Crockett drops names live. Federal evidence release. This is the reckoning. But Jasmine's voice remained steady, unwavering. I am calling for a full, independent federal investigation into the Texas judicial system. Every sealed case, every suspicious clearance, every officer named in a redacted report. No more shadows, no more shields. She paused for a breath. We cannot call this justice if justice fears the light. With that, she stepped away from the podium, not to applause, but to shock. And sometimes that silence was louder. Took mere minutes. The media exploded. Clips of the press conference were looped on every major channel. Analysts scrambled to piece together timelines. Op-eds were drafted before sundown. Commentators called it a judicial earthquake. Social media dubbed it the Reckoning Files. TikTok was filled with reaction videos and side-by-side breakdowns of Boone's cases. Hashtags surged globally. Hashtag Justice for Elijah, hashtag Crockett Reckoning, hashtag Boone Unmasked. Then came the political fallout. Within 24 hours, pressure mounted on the governor's office. Protesters gathered outside state courthouses in Austin, Houston, and El Paso. Local DAs were suddenly asked live on camera about cases they'd buried years ago. 2 congressmen publicly called for DOJ oversight. A third tried to downplay it and was met with a firestorm of backlash. By the third day, the real cracks began to show. 3 judges from the Dallas County Circuit tendered resignation letters quietly, almost in the dead of night, but they were noticed. One by one, those who had operated comfortably behind the curtain were beginning to realize the curtain was gone. Inside courthouses, silence turned into paranoia. Prosecutors double-checked old filings, clerks reviewed access logs, internal affairs received anonymous tips at record numbers. Someone posted a leaked list of every judge who had ever worked on Boone's cases. Dozens of names were now under scrutiny. Trust was collapsing. And yet, through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained composed. Not as a celebrity, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had stared down the storm and kept walking. She knew this wasn't over, not even close, but she had done something most people never get to do in their lifetime. She had turned the system's silence into its most damning confession, and the world had finally heard it. The aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's national press conference reverberated through the justice system like a controlled demolition. Investigations were launched, subpoenas issued, inboxes flooded. The truth could no longer be contained, not by fear, nor rank, nor silence. And now, at last, the very people who had weaponized the law against the powerless were facing the one place they had always thought they could control: a courtroom. But this time, not as prosecutors, not as enforcers, but as defendants. Sergeant Victor Boone, Livia Ramsey, Captain Paul Renner, Investigator Charles Hyland, Deputy Clerk Serena Kay. All 5 stood at the defense table as the trial began in the Southern District Federal Courthouse, under the glare of national cameras and guarded by U.S. Marshals. The very hallways where they had once moved like kings and queens of the system were now lined with press, victims' families, and demonstrators holding signs that read, "We remember Elijah. Justice has a name. No more shadows." And seated at the witness stand, no longer in robes, no longer behind the gavel, was Jasmine Crockett. For the first time in her career, she was not there to judge. She was there to testify. She sat tall, dressed in a simple charcoal gray suit. No jewelry but the small gold pin on her lapel that read "Truth." Her presence silenced the room more powerfully than any court officer's voice ever could. The prosecutor, a federal attorney from Washington named Elaine Brooks, turned to the bench. "Your Honor, the government calls Jasmine Crockett to the stand." There was no hesitation as Jasmine stepped forward. Her oath echoed like thunder in the packed courtroom. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." She took her seat and folded her hands. "Miss Crockett," Brooks began, "you presided over the Boone hearings before stepping down voluntarily. Why?" Jasmine looked directly at the jury. "Because I discovered I was no longer judging a case. I was watching a conspiracy unfold." Her voice didn't tremble. "I received an anonymous flash drive. It contained a recording of Sergeant Boone discussing the deletion of body cam footage after the fatal shooting of Elijah Trent. I compared that against sealed files and discovered evidence of systematic suppression. Witnesses buried, evidence erased, in a chain of signatures that led all the way to this courtroom." She turned her head and met Boone's eyes for the first time since he'd slapped her in that very courtroom months ago. He didn't look back. Brooks continued, "Did you find a pattern?" Jasmine nodded. 9 cases with missing evidence. 4 fatalities. All involved suspects who were either black, undocumented, or mentally ill. All dismissed. All cleared by internal review. And in every one of those, the clearance paperwork included the signature of ADA Ramsey or her staff. The jury took notes with shaking hands. The press was stone silent, recording every word. One reporter whispered to another, "This is history." Brooks walked to the table beside the witness stand and picked up a manila folder. "Miss Crockett, are you familiar with this file?" Jasmine opened it and nodded. That's the signed order by Livia Ramsey to suppress digital footage from a 2017 excessive force complaint. The reason listed was storage corruption, but the internal chain shows it was erased by manual override under her login credentials. She closed the folder. It was the moment I knew this wasn't just about one officer. It was an entire hierarchy protecting itself. The courtroom buzzed like a live wire, tension humming in the walls. Then came the defense. Ramsey's attorney stood, his voice smooth and calculated. "Miss Crockett, isn't it possible you overstepped your role as a judge when you launched a parallel investigation?" Jasmine's eyes didn't waver. "When you're the last line between the people and the truth, you don't ask permission to do what's right. You just do it." Gasps rippled through the room. The defense attorney shifted, adjusting his tie, but Jasmine remained immovable. "What I saw wasn't a technical failure. It was a moral collapse." The cross-examination ended. The judge, appointed by federal justice with no ties to Texas, allowed the jury a 10-minute recess. When they returned, the final phase began. The victims took the stand. The mother of Elijah Trent spoke through tears. The sister of Marcus Navarre, a construction worker mistaken for a fugitive and beaten unconscious, testified with her brother's photo in hand. One by one, the system's ghosts came back into the light. Then came closing arguments. Brooks stood, fire in her voice, steel in her spine. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this isn't just about Sergeant Boone pulling a trigger. It's about a legal system that handed him the gun, looked the other way when he loaded it, and burned the paperwork afterward. Boone may have pulled the trigger, but Livia Ramsey reloaded it, and Paul Renner aimed it. She let the silence grow. Your verdict isn't just for the people who died. It's for every name we'll never know because the evidence to prove they existed was destroyed." The jury deliberated for 2 days. The nation held its breath. Then, finally, the court reconvened. The foreperson rose, hands trembling, voice steady. "In the case of the United States versus Victor R. Boone, we find the defendant guilty of abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and falsifying official records." Boone didn't move. "In the case of Livia Ramsey, we find the defendant guilty of willful suppression of evidence and aiding criminal misconduct." Gasps, tears, applause, swelling from the gallery, quickly silenced by a gavel strike, but the emotion was uncontrollable. Guilty. It had been spoken, not whispered, not delayed, not hidden behind bureaucracy. Spoken. And Jasmine? She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply bowed her head for a moment, a quiet goodbye to every soul the system had tried to erase. Then, she rose from the stand and walked out through the front doors. This time, not as a judge, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a woman who did what the world told her was impossible. She made the system face itself, and it blinked. The verdict echoed across the country like the tolling of a final bell in a long, brutal fight. Justice, long bent, had snapped back into place, even if only for a moment. Jasmine Crockett had not only exposed a deeply rooted conspiracy but forced the legal system to confront the rot inside its own bones. Headlines praised her. Op-eds called her a modern-day crusader. Across the nation, people used her name like a shield. For the first time in decades, courtrooms were filled not just with arguments, but with hope. But Jasmine didn't stay to enjoy the victory. Just 3 days after the sentencing of Victor Boone and Livia Ramsey, Jasmine stood in front of the same podium where she had once shattered the silence of a corrupt system. This time, the cameras were already rolling before she stepped into frame. The air was colder, the sky grayer, and yet, there was a kind of peace in the wind. She adjusted the microphone herself, no assistants, no security detail flanking her. Just Jasmine, the woman who had once stood behind a judge's bench, now standing eye to eye with the people she had fought for. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice low but unwavering. "This will be my final press conference as a sitting officer of the court." A ripple moved through the press pit. Pens paused. Reporters leaned in. Jasmine continued, "Effective immediately, I am resigning my post. Not because I have lost faith in justice, but because I finally understand what justice requires." She let the words land. There was no sorrow in her tone, only clarity. For years, I believed the robe was enough, that the courtroom, the bench, the seal above our heads, those were the tools that kept the law pure. But I was wrong. The system, like any machine, is only as clean as the hands that run it. And we have allowed too many dirty hands to touch what should have been sacred. The silence was no longer professional. It was personal. The room felt it. This country doesn't just need better judges. It needs better watchers. People who are unafraid to ask the hard questions, even when the answers make us uncomfortable. We need eyes in the dark corners. We need accountability that doesn't wear a badge and isn't bound by red tape. She pulled out a folded document from the inside pocket of her blazer. That's why I'm launching a new initiative, a non-governmental watchdog organization. Independent, transparent, and relentless. Its name is the Watchtower of Justice? A few reporters gasped softly. Jasmine smiled, not warmly, but knowingly. The Watchtower will review prosecutorial decisions. It will audit police conduct. It will chase the documents that vanish, the witnesses who are silenced, and the cases that disappear from official records. And it will not stop. Not when pressured. Not when threatened. Not when told to sit down. Her voice rose slightly, like a note held just long enough to tremble. I will no longer be a judge, but I will never stop judging this system until it earns the trust it so casually demands. The moment expanded, and then Jasmine leaned slightly forward, eyes sharper than ever, her voice quieter but somehow heavier. Some of you may remember the moment this fight began. A moment when a man struck me in open court and expected the world to look away. She paused. He thought he'd silenced me. She looked directly into the nearest camera, now through it, every viewer watching. But that slap didn't knock me down. It cracked something open. A fracture in the foundation of a system I had once pledged my life to protect. She exhaled, not from exhaustion, but from release. And it's through that fracture that the light finally came in. She unfolded her resignation letter, signed, sealed, final. This chapter ends today, but the work, the real work, is just beginning. Behind her, the banner for Watchtower of Justice had been raised. A lighthouse, a symbol not of law, but of vigilance. Reporters shouted questions. What would her first investigations be? Would they focus only on Texas? Would they have legal authority? Jasmine answered, only one. Our authority, she said, will come from truth, and truth doesn't need permission. As she stepped away from the microphone, applause erupted. Not from politicians or the press, but from the people standing outside the barricades. Survivors, activists, families holding framed photos of loved ones who never got their day in court. And Jasmine? She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She walked forward, not away from the system, but toward what comes after. The image of Jasmine Crockett walking away from the courthouse, head high, resignation in hand, purpose in her stride, became one of the most replayed video clips in America that year. It was broadcast on the evening news, analyzed on primetime panels, clipped and shared across every platform from TikTok to C-SPAN. But more than that, it was felt in classrooms, in courtrooms, in homes where justice had long been a word people whispered, not trusted. Her name was no longer just associated with one trial. It had become a signal that someone had finally stood up to the machine from the inside. From Seattle to Savannah, her story was taught in criminal law lectures and judicial ethics seminars. Professors played the courtroom recording of her confronting Boone, pausing mid-sentence to let students sit in the weight of her words. In halls once dominated by silent portraits of pale men in robes, you could now find her photo. Jasmine Crockett, former judge, relentless witness. Not because she was perfect, but because she refused to stay silent in a system built on it. Law schools began hosting symposiums titled The Crockett Doctrine, inviting students to discuss not just constitutional interpretation, but moral courage. In Chicago, a group of new public defenders opened a small pro bono firm and called it the 4-Minute Council, a nod to the moment she turned a slap into a national reckoning. In Atlanta, a graduating class of prosecutors took an oath on a mural of her face beneath a quote that had shaken the walls of the courtroom. You never imagined that slap would be the strike that brings down your entire empire. But it wasn't just students who followed her. It was junior clerks who no longer looked the other way. It was rookie officers who challenged senior ones. It was federal interns who copied every sealed file they were told to lose. And above all, it was the ordinary people, those who had always felt like the law was a locked door with no key. Now, they saw in Jasmine what they had always needed to believe: that justice isn't something handed down from power. It's something claimed by those who won't bow to it, because the lesson she left behind wasn't about bravery. It wasn't about brilliance. It was about refusal. Refusal to let a title define your limits. Refusal to believe that authority equals righteousness. Refusal to sit quietly when truth is being erased in real time. And as Watchtower of Justice grew, receiving thousands of tips, tracking dozens of shadowed cases, one truth became painfully clear. Jasmine Crockett didn't break the system. She showed the world where it was already broken. And from those fractures, a new generation rose. One that didn't need a bench to bring justice or a robe to speak truth. They carried her fire forward, lit not by status, but by resolve. Because in the end, Jasmine taught them the most important truth of all. Justice does not come from a title. It comes from the refusal to kneel when the law forgets how to stand. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.